Hey, Steve.
Andres, how's
How's
it
it
going?
going? Good. Good to see you. Is
Good to see you.
it evening? No. Time?
Morning.
No. Morning, right? It's still morning, right?
Yeah, I'm visiting some family, so I'm I moved 1 hour earlier than where I usually live.
Oh, yeah.
So I'm still used to my time, but here it's quite early.
Still dark outside, yeah.
Yeah.
Hey, everybody.
Hello there.
Hey. Before we start, I would like to welcome Patrick to the team. He started last week, the database group. Very happy to have you here. So this is the office hours call for database, and generally use it to talk about any kind of database topics or changes that we want to make and stuff like that.
Thanks.
I'll try to vocalize what Adam put on the agenda. He's not on the call today. So Adam was asking about an issue that we ran into where we skipped the database review, so that didn't make it through database review, and the change was a filter that doesn't perform very well. And I think Adam is wondering, how can we actually detect those query changes? Is there something we can do with danger maybe, or how do we actually realize that queries have been changed in NMR? I think is a very good question. And the proposal to add the finders to database review, I think that's also good. I credit an MR for that if you want to take a look. Do we have any other options to detect those query changes?
I think this is at the discretion of the merge request author and perhaps the backend maintainer. I haven't reviewed the original MR, but I remember this was a query to filter out some usernames, like instead of doing equals, we are doing equals not, or something like that. It was an interesting one. But yeah, I think mostly right now, we require database review for migrations, and for queries, we don't specify what kind of queries though.
I think I'm not too concerned with us skipping the database review for that. It was also in a time where I think we still had the enterprise edition and we were just moving into single code base, so there was a bit of confusion, I think, around that too. And I agree that as a developer, you probably know best what changes you're making. But still, it's a interesting question. If we had a way to sort of say that, oh, these are the queries that your change affects, that would be perfect for us. We could sort of automate getting query plans from that and all that, but it's really hard to detect those changes. I thought we could probably run all the tests and record the queries and look what the difference is, but it's I don't think that's a very good approach to that.
Something that worries me about requiring a database review on the app finders folder is that we have a lot of finders, and we also will need to list like the finders under the EE folder. So perhaps that is not the first step. Perhaps the first step is to detect which finders do need a database review, like the projects finder, which is like a big one, and the users finders and the merge request finder, like the ones that we know, the ones that are painful for us. So perhaps we do require a merge request on certain files and specific files instead of requiring in the whole folder, because we have a bunch. Does that make sense?
That's a good point. So we will be focusing on the bigger finders, and the more flexible ones, I think, is where you can make the most mistakes, or we have these.
Yeah,
I think this is really a problem for us. We have this, when you look at the projects finders, like this huge finder class where you can apply all kinds of different filters, and depending on that, we construct one SQL query for you. So it's sometimes really hard to see what impact that has. Thanks for adding that to the agenda.
So
Right.
on the same line, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
On the same line, I also have encountered some merge requests that have the database label and the database review pending label, and somehow backend maintainers forgot to assign to a database reviewer, or the same merge request author skip those. I think we haven't encountered like a big problem, but perhaps a reminder should be nice, like if you are modifying migrations or you are modifying files that need database review, a database review is required. I still need to pull some numbers on how many of those we have. I don't think we have that many, but I have encountered at least 2 or 3. But yeah, just wanted to mention that.
Should we send out a reminder on the backend call, or what would you suggest?
I would like to perhaps analyze the merge request that we have for 12.7. Which milestone we are? 12, whatever we are. And then try to see how many of those have the database label and how many of those were not reviewed by any of us. Mm-hmm. Because I only found 3, but we can have more.
Oh, it's a good idea to send a reminder. All right. Next topic is about triggers or constraints. And if I get that question correctly, then it's sort of about how do we validate constraints across tables? Because in this case, it's a unique constraint, and the suggestion was to, or the need was to validate a unique constraint across 2 tables. So it's nothing you can do with a unique index, because index only goes for 1 table. And I think what's been discussed here was to use constraint triggers or functions to check that. I found those really interesting to read, the article from Cybertech, for example. Interestingly, it finishes with a sentence, constraint triggers are not the solution. And it was interesting to read because you suffer from a consistency problem there, or there's a race condition where you don't catch what you're actually looking for. So not totally sure. This is maybe depend on the use case, but it's in general there is this race condition, so that makes it a problem. Has anybody used constraint triggers or had this problem before? I was wondering if perhaps maybe the model is something that can be changed as well. So having a need to apply a unique constraint across 2 tables, maybe that already suggests that the model can be changed in a way that you can actually enforce that easily or easier. I'm not sure about this particular model though.
And I can comment a little on that since this was my merge request. Yeah, that was one of the thoughts I had, was that, perhaps because we're seeing this need, maybe that's pointing to a bigger problem with the overall structure of the tables. And so the way things are currently set up with this, the entire package management systems, is that there's one central packages table that just has very basic data like name and version and connects it to a project. And then depending on which package type you have, if it's a NPM package, there's an NPM metadata table. If it's a Maven package, there's a Maven metadata table. And so that's sort of just, that's kind of like how it was initially set up. So that's the pattern we've continued to follow. But in this case, with these Conan packages, there arises a need to check this uniqueness based on some of that metadata, not just the name and version. And I expect that this won't be the only time that this is going to come up. So I know that we talk about in some of the development docs, you know, just having, when we talk about polymorphism, just doing completely separate tables for everything rather than trying to combine things. So maybe this is a case to argue that this should just be split out into completely its own separate table. Open to any thoughts or suggestions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. With the hierarchy, maybe splitting that out into individual tables is something you can do. Or, I mean, you can also think about like denormalizing stuff where you extract that information into yet another table. The information that you need to enforce the unique constraint, and you use that to do exactly this. But maybe you already end up with a full table for the code and packages then. And another alternative, I'm not sure how good it is though, but an alternative is to that Postgres provides you is also table inheritance, where I think it's applicable here. Again, I'm not sure if it's a good solution, but what you can actually do is also to replicate the hierarchy in the database schema. So you would actually have a parent table with the common schema, and then child tables that can add columns to that. And the child tables, they can have individual indexes. For example, you can have a unique index on the child table for the Conan packages where you have all the information available. We haven't done that though, so there's no prior GitLab experience with that.
Yeah, perhaps I'll open an issue for some more discussion about the way to possibly structure this data in a better way in the future. I think right now it sounds like in this specific case, to keep this moving, we're just going to continue with a validation that we have in place, but definitely worth revisiting.
Mm-hmm. Cool, that's an interesting topic. Any other comments, or should we move on? Moving on. Myra, would you like to go?
Yes, sure. So I was wondering if we have some sort of limit to bigger tables. I know we don't, but perhaps we should consider having one. Projects, for example, it is humongous, and I think also users. And Alper is right. Also, application settings. Well, perhaps application settings is not the problem. It's not a problem because it only has one record, and it is supposed to only have one record. But in the case of projects, in which we have like millions and millions of records, I'm not sure if it is a good idea to continue adding columns. And one of the disadvantages of doing that is because we cannot easily add a default in those tables because, well, we can't, because, well, it is complicated. So I wanted to hear everybody's thoughts.
Soon we can add the default with Postgres 11, but there are other drawbacks from those tables as well. I think the primary thing I'm thinking about is when you have different use cases for, let's say, projects, and so you have this code that only needs a part of the projects table, and you have the other perspective where you need maybe a different part. You always have a performance impact because you always read the whole record, right? There's no way you can read only a subset of a record from disk So if you have a very wide table, then you always suffer from, hey, I have to, whatever I do with this, I always have to do the full record in order to get that. Maybe that's already an indication that hey, if we have these different use cases, then maybe the modeling should follow that, and we extract a table that is for the one use case, and then there is the other one, maybe the core use case of the projects table is different from that. I think Ton prepared a MR that's currently in flight, right, to extract the project settings table.
I think we have several like project related tables. We have project authorizations, we have project CI/CD settings, and we have like a couple of more. And I think when it comes to add a new column to projects, we might want to take a look at all the projects table and perhaps try to find a place there. And I also think that it might not be a big deal if we create another table, perhaps just with one column, instead of adding it to the projects table. I think that might be another solution.
Yeah.
Yes, it depends on the user model, as you said.
So Mario, what is on your mind? Like, you know, there's already the database limits on the number of columns. Do you have, like, do you want to put more limit than that, or?
Yeah, no, it was something just to keep in mind when reviewing merge requests. Like if we review one that is adding a column in the table projects, and this column might be, well, it can also be fit in another table. It might be better to move it to another table, or to also consider creating a new table. And then if none of those options work, maybe, well, we just add it to the projects table.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think over 200 columns, for example, we could safely give an alarm. But if you have something lower in mind, because dividing is better, I think for people, adding a column for developers appears to be easier than, you know, creating a table.
Yeah,
especially
I think it was
one-to-one. Yeah. So.
I think this is sort of what led to those wide tables. That it's mostly always easier to just add a column to an existing table than to create a new model, create a new table, and use that. I think, Ton, the project settings table, what you're doing there is only preparing this separate table, right? You're not. So the first change is not to extract columns and move them over, but it's just to create this table, make sure it is filled. So it's actually easier to add columns to this table, right? So this is a preparation for future columns coming in, right?
Yeah, I didn't want to bother with moving over columns and making sure that all the UI components and everything know which model to write. So by just creating the table, making sure the project entries are there, it should be easier to add the columns to that table instead to the regular project table, so that it won't grow even bigger.
So Mario, if you open an issue, maybe we can analyze like the tables by their column counts and come up to conclusions on how it affects performance and how having a one-to-one relationship affects migrations and performance.
Yeah, it's a good idea. I will open an issue. Thanks.
Another situation I had recently was when we added a column in an MR, we also discussed if all the records in this table should actually get a value for it. So sometimes you add something, but it's maybe only relevant for a subset of those records, for a certain type of records or stuff like that. Maybe goes a bit back to also the packages problem, where you have these hierarchies. And if it turns out that only a particular type of record needs these additional information, then I think this is also a good indicator to say, like, oh, why don't we split that into whatever the type, the use case is, and split it into a separate table and have this one-on-one relationship. So I think that's always a good question to ask in the review.
I was just kind of thinking with having a limit sort of on the number of columns. I mean, my concern there would be that people are going to see that, you know, there's a limit, say we say 150 columns, more than that is problematic. At the point they're adding a new column, they start to think perhaps this should be a new table, but it's not really about just moving that individual column out. It's taking, you know, pieces of functionality that are grouped together and building a new table around those in like a schema design type of way that makes sense, not just kind of reaching a limit and saying, this is bigger than we want to be, so let's sort of create this ad hoc table that doesn't really group to anything else. So I think that's something that we should try to, however we tackle this, keep that in mind.
It's a good point. You can also think that as long as you haven't reached that limit of 150 columns, it's always okay to add to the original table, which is also misleading, of course.
Yeah, and actually the bigger question here is not the limit of columns, it's how should I design it as, I faced that situation in a design actually now. I have a field for the users, but I'm inclined to put it on an one-to-one table to users. So I think Myra's question and Pat's point is exactly not, I mean, how should I design it better? And the reviewer, should I point to create a new table, or should I say, hey, just move this to the existing table? And should it be dependent only on the column size or the domain knowledge of schema design?
Do we have any kind of documentation or guidance towards how to model the database or how to create those new schemas? I'm not sure.
We don't.
No, we don't. I mean, we are based on the Rails application architecture, but beyond that, people seem to, you know, create tables whenever necessary, or, I mean, there's no rule there, which.
Maybe that's a good topic for, I don't know, some technical writing or some blog post or documentation.
And also, are certain tables excluded from adding new columns? Like on the users table, I'm afraid to put there some very unrelated growth columns, because I think users is like more or less has an exclusive status. It should be more or less users. So I want to avoid actually users table. But am I thinking right or not? There's no, I mean, I don't have any guidance or any way to any documentation.
I think you're right. There are surely like tables that are very core to the application, right? Users or projects. We also see that, for example, locking on those tables is a problem where you have a lot of traffic, and this is sort of an indicator that they are used quite a lot, right? And I think we should be more careful with those tables than others. Obviously, it makes sense to always consider that. But you know, the bigger the impact is on the tables that have high traffic, for example, right?
Yeah, as you said, high traffic tables now seem to be less of a candidate for new columns. And as Myra said at the beginning, application settings has one column, so maybe high traffic but low, you know, record number. Then I think that's adding their new columns seems to be plausible. maybe. So if we have a discussion, then a bigger one, we can discuss that.
I was just reminded of the schema diagram that we generated once. Have you all seen that? Luckily, it's not a full graph,
Yeah.
so some edges are missing, but it's really impressive as well. Maybe that's also something that is, makes this visible, that there are very large tables where you have a lot of columns. Ben, would you like to vocalize the?
Yeah, sure.
split?
Yeah, the discussion reminded me of a table split that I tripped over investigating an issue in support, which was that the table associated with project and individual activity, the one that produces the matrix in your profile, that got split up at one point. So I think originally that table had each record, if it related to a Git repository changes, it had the information about that in the record, and it got split into a separate table. All the other activity in that table, as far as I can see, is key references to other tables. So you know, if it's creating a user, for example, it refers to it just kind of calls out to another table, whereas Git wasn't doing that. So that got split up. So yeah, there's some commits there if you want to see what that looked like.
Yeah, that's a similar kind of thing. Did that lead to any like problems that we still have?
Well, the reason why I was investigating that is, so it was a few versions back. It's like 8 or 9 or 10 or something. I can't remember. They all blur that far back. And there's been a few suggestions. So in addition to that, around the same time, housekeeping was introduced on that table to only keep a year's data or so. And that housekeeping's got expanded since then. So we're keeping more data in there now. And we've had customers saying that their activity data is vanishing. And at first pass, we tend to say, well, yeah, there's housekeeping on there. And obviously, if they're still on an old version, that housekeeping is fairly aggressive and they're more likely to notice it. But then there's been a few hints that random other data is vanishing as well, much more recent data. And that was why, that's why I was looking into that for a customer, because they had a project with fairly low activity in it. And so when data vanished, over a year, it was very obvious because there wasn't much activity, but also they had like sort of branch creations. They could see the branch being merged in the activity history, but the branch creation from a week or two prior was missing. And that seems to have coincided with them upgrading to the version which, or either to the version or through the version which did the table split, but also introduced the housekeeping. We never really got to the bottom of it, but that's why I spent a long time trying to understand that part of the schema. Mainly because I was looking at a much later version because the table names changed as well. So I was asking them to run queries and they were getting nothing back at all. Yeah, I've got an issue open for that, but customers not come back on that. And it's a difficult one. Interestingly, just while it's on my mind, one of the possible workarounds for that might be to back up and restore the repositories, because when you do that, it adds activity entries, and I'm wondering if the backup and restore process literally has database records for the activity table, or whether actually as the restore is done, the Git data is passed and generates the records. But I've not had reason to play around with that to investigate it.
I can only guess that this is part of the database backup, but I'm not sure.
That would be my guess. It would be the obvious way of doing it.
Could you drop on the link to the issue for
Yep,
the
will
customer
do.
problem?
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, and following this over upgrades, I think this is really difficult. It's really adding another dimension to schema migrations makes these things very difficult to follow. All right, should we move on to strings versus integer for numbers?
Yep. So I was reviewing yesterday a community contribution that it is adding some tables, and I noticed that we were using an integer for a serial number. Now, I am not very familiar with the background of this MR. Like, I was just doing a database review and not a Barcade maintainer review. So in my head, a serial number, it is like a kind of a long number. So I wasn't very sure of using an integer because we could have like an error of range out of range or something like that. So I suggested perhaps it might be better to use a string. And then this person explained, according to this standard, this should be an integer. And we started talking, and that was it. And now I am reading that Andrea suggested as binary, which seems this is interesting because this resembles a SHA. Okay.
Yeah, that was. I was wondering if that is sort of similar to that. Where you know when we store Git chars, we also put them into binary because then you don't have to store the encoding, and it boils down to like half the storage needs than for a string. In this case, it's sort of it is 20 bytes long, right? The serial number. So yeah, that's beyond the integer range. I wasn't sure about numeric types. So there is the numeric data type that is much larger than integer. But I don't think we have any reason to use a numeric type for it, right? We're not like doing any math on the serial number or stuff like that. So perhaps the binary is a good choice in the end.
Yeah, it seems like a good choice. Perhaps it will be nice to also add this to our guidelines because we don't have guidelines regarding what type to use when it comes to a large number or a SHA type.
We have a bit of documentation for it, but it specifically talks about SHA-1s. I'll drop that in the agenda.
I can't open the comment. I don't know somehow. Which field is it? What is the name of the column?
It's a new table that we're creating for certificates. And this is the serial number of the certificate.
Yeah, the serial number. So why are you against a numeric type with a long, range? I mean, we are not adding definitely.
I just wasn't sure about it, if it would fit the numeric type. Probably it would for 20 bytes. But then since we're not doing any math on the serial number, maybe there's not even a benefit from using a numeric type for it.
I have no idea about that document. Huh. I will make sure to link it also on the database guides.
Mm-hmm.
And perhaps, yeah, cool.
I think we have this quite in a few places, considering that we have a lot of SHAs around. And in some places we still have, I think this was introduced at some time, so this suggestion. And in some places we still have, we still store SHAs as string, and then we even join tables where one table has it as a string and the other one as a binary, and then you have to really fiddle around to, to express that join condition correctly with like considering encoding and stuff like that. So I think it's much easier to just go for the binary everywhere for those type of things. And possibly, I don't know if that was the case here, but the serial number, the example that also had spaces, maybe that's something that we can also remove from what we store in the database, right?
Yeah, are you talking about the example that Tong put? I'm not sure if this is like a real example. I think he only chose like random characters, but I'm not sure.
It looks like when you format the serial number nicely, then you put like 2 hex characters in a space and that. But for storing that in the database, you just don't need those spaces, right? So it's purely a presentation kind of thing.
Okay.
Other thoughts on that topic?
Thanks.
Sure. Then I'm shortly going to advertise the structure SQL change. So there's an MR out there if you haven't seen that yet, where we changed the way we track the Rails schema or the database schema changed it from schema RB to structure SQL in hopes of using more advanced Postgres features, which is much easier done because you don't have to teach Rails the tricks, but you rather use a plain SQL schema dump. Any comments on that? Appreciated. There is a dependency to Omnibus and charts that we discovered. That is because new installations, they start from scratch using that schema, and the rake tasks are slightly different. But other than that, I think looks pretty good, and maybe we can merge that soon. This is also preparation for partitioning. I think it makes it much easier to use that going forward. Is there something that keeps us from doing that, or do you have experience using structure SQL instead of schema Ruby and Rails?
Is there any change for developers when it comes to use schema?
So the migrations, they are not affected by this. You're still doing the same things there. The only thing that changes is really this schema tracking, and whenever you run the migrations, you get a full schema dump from your local database. Similar to what you did with schema RB, you would check in the changes for structure SQL, and it may be a little bit trickier to figure out which changes are or actually need committing, or what are the changes that are only related to the migration that you ran. I think this problem also pops up with the schema RB, where migrations are applied out of order, and then you have to figure out what relates to your database. What I typically do is I start from scratch. I reset my database to the master schema, and then I run the migration, and then you have to change that you want, basically. Other than that, I think I'm hoping it's a little bit better on the conflicting side. So we always have in schema RB, we always have this conflict with the schema version. So I think this happens to pretty much every MR that changes the schema. You run into this conflict, you fix that later. I'm hoping that goes away with the structure SQL, because that treats it a little bit differently. Other than that, I don't think there's a lot of differences left. You have to deal with SQL better or more than you do before, obviously.
Yeah, So what will happen to the schema file? Is it going to be deleted?
I think ultimately we can remove it. We don't need it anymore. So far in the MR, I've just put a comment into it, and I think I'm also raising an exception if you still include that. It would blow up in CI, and making a note that this isn't being used anymore, and we should use structure SQL instead. Ultimately, I think we don't need it anymore. Cool. And the other thing I wanted to advertise is a change Adam made that came in recently with the migration helper that helps with the locking of tables. So you can use with log retries now and wrap your migration changes into that, and it's going to make sure that the lock timeout is handled and it doesn't lock tables forever, maybe causing a downtime, but it gradually increases the lock timeout and it keeps retrying until you succeed, or it runs out of retries at the moment, and then it's still doing the same thing as we do today. And I think we will need to, we discussed this here before, I think we will need to have some experience seeing that in production to tune the retry and the lock timeouts and all that. And the first migration that we are going to see using that is just dropping unneeded tables, but it's difficult insofar that those tables still have a foreign key constraint to projects, for example, and hence you need a lock on the projects table. And yeah, this is the first use case for it. Hopefully we get some experience from it to tune it a little bit better. And then we can also start writing some documentation around it. That is also still missing for development documentation. Cool. Ben, you have the last point.
Yeah, I can't remember if I introduced myself in a previous one, but I volunteered to be support stable counterpart for the database team, so that's kind of why I'm here, absorbing information. I've linked to the job description there. It's about kind of knowing about database issues that customers are hitting and surfacing those, and knowing about what's going on with databases and taking that information down into support and advising our customers. So I thought this one might be of interest. From last weekend, a colleague who was on call got paged for an emergency where a customer had upgraded their Postgres on Amazon RDS and missed the one-liner in the documentation that they need to run and analyze after doing that. And they paged us because it was running like it was nailed to the floor. So fortunately, some Googling tracked that one down. So I'll be getting that in the docs. We've got a reference architecture for AWS HA. I'll at least link to wherever I put it in there, because I've already mentioned it to one customer who's running RDS but isn't running the HA architecture. So it's going to be I'll spend a bit of time tracking down the best place to put it.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Thank you for joining the call. It's great to have you here. I was wondering if this is something that we can automate, running the analyze after an upgrade, or what was the upgrade related to Postgres itself?
I think it was. That's a good question. I haven't actually reviewed the ticket. I mean, we would see this a lot if we weren't encountering it. So I imagine it was just a standalone Postgres upgrade.
I think
customers often try not to do both at the same time because obviously not automated in the way it is in Omnibus.
I think the Postgres upgrade makes more sense in this case because this is where you might lose the statistics and you have to run the analyze afterwards. Yeah. But I'm not even sure if what we do when we upgrade for Omnibus, because this is where we handle also the Postgres upgrade, right? I don't know if we actually run analyze after the upgrade. Maybe that's something we should be doing.
I think we'd have tripped over this before if we weren't. I'll brute force the repo and see if I can find it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'll add a note to the doc if I track everything down.
Mm-hmm. Perfect, thank you. Cool, I think that wraps it up nicely. We're also on time. So thank you for joining the call, and talk to you later. Have a nice day.